In February 1988, in a quiet suburb of Rochester, Minnesota, a 16-year-old killed his parents and two of his siblings with an axe. He'd been telling people for 6 months he was going to do it. They thought he was venting. He wasn't. Rochester, Minnesota built its identity around the Mayo Clinic. People come from all over the world to have whatever is wrong with them finally named and addressed. It's a city whose entire reputation rests on the idea that problems, given the right attention and the right people paying attention, can be solved, which makes it one of the more quietly haunting places for a story about a family where the problem was visible to almost everyone around it and identified far too late to matter. Bernard and Paulette Brom were both 41 years old, raising 4 kids in a house that people drove past and felt good about the neighborhood. They lived in Cascade Township, were deeply Catholic, and ran an organized household where showing up on time and treating structure as a form of love were simply how things worked. Bernard held the family to clear expectations about what acceptable behavior looked like. Paulette was the devoted anchor of the whole thing. Joseph, the eldest at 18, was already making his own way. Diane was 13, enrolled at Lourdes High School. Richard was 11. And then there was David, born October 3rd, 1971. 16 years old, polite to adults, and increasingly unreachable in the way that certain teenagers become when they are drowning in something they cannot name, and nobody around them is thought to ask about it. What David would later describe as a cloud had been sitting over him for years before any of this happened. And in the 1980s, that description would have gotten you exactly nowhere, clinically. Adolescent depression was not on anyone's checklist. If a kid was withdrawn, that was just adolescence, kids being kids. If he seemed detached, that was just his personality. A slow erosion of hope and connection, filling the emptiness with increasingly dark thoughts over the months and years. Didn't have a treatment pathway in suburban Rochester in 1988. David went unaddressed. The cloud got heavier, and the thoughts inside it got louder. For at least 6 months before February 1988, David had been telling people, not hinting at it, but telling people outright. His classmates at Lourdes High School heard him talk about killing his parents with enough regularity that it had become background noise in certain social circles. The academic term for this leakage, the pre-act communication of homicidal intent, and researchers who study it constantly find that the people who receive these statements almost never know what to do with them. In 1988, there were no threat assessment protocols, no trained personnel working through behavioral checklists. His peers heard it, processed it as frustrated venting from an unhappy kid, and they moved on. This cycle repeated for 6 months. On the evening of February 17th, Bernard and David argued over a music tape. This was the absolute peak of the Satanic Panic, by the way, which was America's full-scale moral meltdown over the idea that heavy metal music was actively recruiting teenagers into something dark. Tipper Gore, Al Gore's wife, was holding congressional hearings about it. Parent groups were petitioning radio stations. Bernard Brom, objecting to an unapproved tape in his teenager's hands, and February 1988 was completely normal Tuesday middle-class America. The argument happened around 11:30 at night. Then the house went quiet. David didn't sleep. He stayed awake until 3 o'clock in the morning, sitting alone in the silence with whatever was moving through his head. Those 3 hours matter enormously in understanding what happened next, because they eliminate the idea of a sudden, impulsive break. 3 hours is not necessarily a snap decision. The psychological picture that emerged during the trial described those 3 hours as deep rumination, a cold settling of something that had been building for years. At some point during that window, David went down to the basement and retrieved a 2 to 3 foot axe, then went back upstairs. He went to his parents' bedroom first. Bernard, according to what David later described to a friend, kept getting up after being struck with the axe. Paulette was attacked in the same room. Then David moved to Richard's bedroom. Richard was 11 years old and almost certainly asleep when it happened. Diane, 13 years old, was found in the upstairs hallway. She had apparently heard something and gotten out of bed. She was the last of the four. When investigators eventually processed the scene, they counted between 56 and 58 individual wounds spread across all four victims. The next morning, David did not leave Rochester. He found a female classmate named Patty Price and convinced her to skip school with him. He later told her calmly and in detail what happened the previous night. He described the sequence. He described his father getting back up. Price would later describe the conversation as something her brain simply could not reconcile with anything she understood to be real. At the school, the absence of David, Diane, and Richard had already been noticed. By mid-morning, rumors were moving through the student body. David killed his dad. David killed his whole family. The school administration contacted the Olmsted County Sheriff's Office. Deputies arrived at the Brom home that evening, initially expecting a home invasion or kidnapping. Then they found the bodies. Kevin Torgerson, a young deputy on the scene that night, would eventually become the Olmsted County Sheriff. He has spoken in the years since about the sensory memory of that house, something he carried through 37 years of professional and personal life. David was spotted the following afternoon, February 19th, at a payphone near a post office in northwest Rochester. He surrendered without incident, a skinny teenager who had just committed the most notorious mass killing in Minnesota history. The trial ran in 2 phases under Minnesota procedure. Phase 1 established whether David committed the acts. The defense wanted psychiatric testimony about his capacity to premeditate, and the court refused under existing case law, holding that psychiatric evidence is irrelevant to intent, which must be inferred from the physical evidence alone. He was found guilty. Phase 2 addressed his mental state at the time of the murders. Defense experts testified about visual hallucinations, psychotic features, and 3 distinct alter egos they said governed his psychology. The prosecution acknowledged real, severe depression, but argued it didn't prevent David from understanding that killing 4 members of your family was wrong. The jury sided with the prosecution. On October 16, 1989, David Brom was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms and 1 concurrent life term, a sentence that, under Minnesota sentencing calculations, effectively meant dying in prison for actions he committed at 16 years old. Early coverage had vaguely referenced his music tape as the trigger for the argument the night before the murders. An experimental music group called Negativland decided to use that detail. They issued a fake press release claiming their song, Christianity is Stupid, had influenced David and that the FBI was now investigating them in connection with the case. This was 1988, pre-internet, and the hoax worked amazingly well. Major television affiliates and newspapers reported the connection as established fact. Negativland later used every piece of that fabricated coverage to build an album called Helter Stupid, sampling actual news reports about the Brom murders as a pointed critique of how readily society reaches for a cultural scapegoat rather than sitting with the harder questions about mental health access and domestic failure. There was absolutely zero evidence that David had ever even heard of Negativland. The connection was invented wholesale, and the press ran away with it. David Brom spent more than 35 years at the Minnesota Correctional Facility in Lino Lakes. By every documented account, the violence of February 18, 1988, did not reoccur behind those walls. Board members who reviewed his record over the years eventually described him as a model prisoner, someone who had engaged seriously with mental health treatment and developed the internal stability that nobody had helped him build when he was a teenager in Cascade Township. While David was serving his sentence, juvenile justice law was shifting at the highest levels. The U.S. Supreme Court, through decisions in Miller v. Alabama and Montgomery v. Louisiana, established that mandatory life without parole sentences for juvenile offenders were unconstitutional, grounded partly in research demonstrating the adolescent's brain's genuine capacity for change over time. In 2023, the Minnesota legislature passed a law retroactively making juvenile offenders eligible for parole after 15 years. David Brom was among those who became eligible under it. In January 2025, 53 years old, David appeared before the Supervised Release Board. He offered an apology to his surviving brother Joseph and to the Rochester community. He described his ongoing mental health management through a peer recovery support network. The board voted 5-1 to grant him a step-down-to-work release. He was released on January 29, 2025, to a Twin Cities halfway house under GPS monitoring, with a condition permanently prohibiting him from returning to Olmsted County. Sheriff Torgerson said publicly that the release was hard to accept, that 37 years hadn't changed what he walked into inside that house. Several lawmakers called the 2023 law dangerous and argued certain crimes should sit permanently outside the reach of second chances. Others pointed to the Supreme Court's reasoning and more to the 3 decades of documented behavioral record. Joseph Brom, the surviving brother, had stayed largely outside of the public conversation through all of it. What happened in Cascade Township in the early hours of February 18, 1988, destroyed a family and produced questions that Rochester has been working through ever since. Some questions don't resolve cleanly. They just continue. Thanks for listening to 10-Minute Murder, bingeable true crime stories. Hello, I'm Joe. I'm the host. And here is an email. Subject: one that I hadn't heard before. Hi, Joe. Your episode on the Tylenol murders caught me off guard. I'd heard the name before, but I never understood how much it changed everyday life until you explained it the way that you did. The ripple effect was the part that really stuck with me. I've since recommended your podcast to a few friends because of how clearly you broke that down. Brian in Illinois. And Brian, I tell you what, thanks for listening, by the way. I was alive during that time. It's like 82, 81, 82. I may be wrong about that, but I think it's the early 80s. I was very small. And obviously, that's not something I would remember. I mean, I wasn't old enough to be forming those kind of memories at that time. But you would think that would be a story that you would hear about growing up. Oh, don't use Tylenol. It would still be a thing. You know, that's what I'm trying to say. But I never heard about it. It wasn't until I started doing this podcast and someone recommended that I look into that story that I was like, oh man, this was happening when I was a small child, and this is something that I never knew about. Now, you being from Illinois, you probably, if you're old enough, you probably heard about it growing up, because that's mainly where it took place. But it affected nationwide. Yeah, crazy story. Hey, if you're a brand new listener to this podcast, make sure you hit subscribe right now. You can also go to the show notes of this episode, and you'll find links to where you can find the podcast on social media. You'll find a link to my website, which is 10minutemurder.com, and also links to where you can listen to my newest podcast. It's called True Crime Blueprint. It's kind of like this podcast, except a little more casual, a lot longer episodes. So check that out. It's True Crime Blueprint. And that's going to do it. That's your episode for today. Thank you again for listening to 10-Minute Murder. See you next time.